Hello there, and welcome to Writing Critiques. My name is Vin, and this is the channel where we critique writing from around the internet. You can submit your writing to the email down below, but with that, we're just going to go straight into it for today's piece. This is by Reddit user asdJesus, and I found it on the Fantasy Writers Reddit thread where he or she put it up for she. It's a piece of fantasy, which is kind of one of my favorite genres, so hopefully this is good. And the name of the piece is Ada of Tumber. We're looking at the prologue today, and I've already got my virtual assistant lined up, so hopefully her reading is for this one is good. I trialed it out a little bit and seemed fine. So again, we first read through it and then we give our critiques afterwards. And to help us read, let's see if we can get her going. So starting in 3, 2, 1.
Prologue. A last glance. Doors were barred and windows were barren of onlookers. To speak against ignorance proclaimed from atop the marble thrones was condemning, thus there was silence. To act against the constable was to go up against his iron fist and the force of his men, thus there was stillness. There was, however, a melodic prayer shut behind the locked doors and empty windows. An encore of whispered well-beings entrenched upon the minds and tongues of many and spoken for the sake of those crushed by undeserved misfortune. It alone defied the quiet stillness. A cold wind swept orange-red leaves from the stagnant street before them. Ada's eyes rested there, where the air met stone, unfocused and teary. The cool iron of his gauntlet bit at her arm with a sharp chill. His hand adjusted tightly around her bicep. The pain of it was far from her mind. His thumb pressed into her underarm, pinching her skin. She winced thoughtlessly. She saw red and another breeze tousled the leaves. They slid and tumbled before returning the street to its unsettling stillness. She lost step for a timeless moment and her feet felt to trail and knock against the hard stone ground as the guard dragged her behind him. He was not one of the guards she knew. His cold hard eyes and determined detriment suggested that perhaps he was a soldier in the past, maybe a mercenary tired of the trade and turned to a more civilized form of suture busting. But Ada's head was hot and blurry, and far from making characteristic observations such as these, it felt feverish. Each second was like waking from a nightmare in a cold sweat. She spasmed frantically for a dozenth time and found her fist banging weakly against the iron plating of his shoulder. Her hand had bloodied with the trauma of it. He shrugged her carelessly away and let her body slack to the ground for a moment. Then, grabbing her hair in a tight fist, he shook her head back and forth as if scolding an overly prideful half-chip whore, which he was surely accustomed to doing. "Come now, m'lady," he spat through a yellow, toothy smile. "Don't go doing none o' that." Ada wept louder. The sound was horrible and cracked. She brought her eyes up numbly from the ground, from the stirring leaves and familiar grey stone. She looked back to her home and more tears welled in her eyes. The town of Tumber sat unnaturally still beneath her grasping gaze. The black slate roofing caught the sunlight, and the cool stone slab sat sturdy as ever along the street. She longed to grasp hold of one, to ground herself. She wailed into another bout of wordless struggle. The guard tugged sharply at her arm and threw her scrambling to the ground. She hit hard, her head striking against a fist-sized stone. Her mouth drew into a tight line and her eyes clenched shut. She shook violently and her head spun. Her forearm lay at a jagged angle, broken just above the wrist. She wept breathlessly, her stomach ached and strained into a knot. Blood pooled into the dirt around her head. Then, as the world faded to nothing, the familiar tinge of cold iron wrapped itself around her ankles and the guard began dragging her further and further from the city limits. These were her last memories of Tumber. They were heavy in her heart and never far from her thoughts. Trauma of the past haunts the present so. It was in sleep that her mind most commonly fell back to this time, and thus her sleep was often restless. It was in each and every armor-clad wanderer she found herself hiding from along the road that she was plagued with flashbacks. It was in the light scar just above her temple and the badly healed break halfway down her arm that she stoked an angry flame within herself. Her pain was as her, hidden and sharp. Chapter 1. The cliff above it was near dusk by the time she crested the mountain's peak. The sun's orange light lingered in the sky. It pushed past thin lines of storm-laden cloud to meet her face. The mountain top was still and breezeless. Only small barren bushes and narrow, light-barked trees accompanied her. The torch-lit town of Tumber sat heavy beneath her gaze at the base of the cliff in a similar stillness to that of the plateau. The woman was not tall nor short. She wore leather armor with silver studs that covered her chest and had black riding boots worn beyond any value. A rich red cape cut diagonally across her back and fell to one of her hips where a swordless scabbard swayed with her stride. In her hands, gloved by velvet green hunting mitts, she held a hickory longbow and 2 dull steel-head arrows. Her eyes were a dark and mossy green that caught the light aflame in their reflection. Her face, framed by gold-inlaid brown braids, was fierce and beautiful. The light turned to a yellow stain hardly stretching past the horizon as she began making camp, and the torchlight warming her home below gradually disappeared into the bitterness of night. She had traveled a long ways that day and hunted to no avail for several hours, but to no condolence of her aching shoulders or blistered feet, Ada could not find sleep amidst the darkness. Somewhere between her empty stomach and weary mind, Ada was held from rest and, as if restrained, all she could do was thrash against her tireless thoughts. It was 7 long hours before the yellow stain reappeared on the other side of the skyline, illuminating the plateau once more with a hazy sheen. Lines of fog snaked between and around her legs as she stood, her shirt plastered to her back in a cold, leftover sweat. She began back to her cliffside lookout, accompanied only by a chilling wind which swept briskly off the mountains to her south and filled her cape with a dramatic billow. Her pose overlooking the landscape would have been striking if not for the dark bags under her eyes and all too visible ribs beneath her fine linen tunic. Time had passed Ada slowly outside the walls, and to no end the severities of unsheltered life plagued her. Her desperate search after her family proved fruitless time and time again until she did little more than pray to Henlock and all that served him in hopes they still lived. It was by women instinctive necessity alone that she returned, and by fear and blatant awareness of her ever-crooked arm that she maintained her perch atop the cliff. She looked but to touch is to feel. Several hours passed in observation. Ada sat barefoot, her boots propped against a rock to her side and her feet dangling off the edge. Her town was bustling below. Merchants came and went in the midsummer's craze, and a large caravan of hooded wagons painted all manner of colors had stationed before the hall, presumably a troop of some kind. It was the flap of a bird's wings that stirred her from her downwardly locked gaze and brought her mouth from a familiar yet sour smile to an emotionless frown. A large hawk with golden brown feathers and a gnarled yellow beak cried out overhead. It let out a shrill, banshee-like screech as it swooped closely above, its outstretched wing almost brushing Ada's upturned face. Her frown turned quickly, startled as she dodged backwards. Was it not too early for the Ilfgaard's rounds to have reached the west? She thought.
Huh. Okay. So that's all I'm going to go for now. I'm not going to go on to chapter 2. I don't know what to think about that. That's interesting. So there's parts of this I really like the description is actually quite good for a lot of it, and I think the writing is mostly fine. There's bits here where you have too many adverbs in close proximity, like she spasmed frantically for a dozenth time and found her fist banging weakly against the iron plating of his shoulder. Like, too many adverbs. You don't need that. You can cut that here. So here and there, the actual writing is a bit like a verbose. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of words happening and not many things happening. If you know what I mean. For a lot of it, I know you're trying to set the tone. So okay, let's take a step back. We read out 2 sections, which is the prologue and chapter 1. I actually had only heard the prologue before recording this because I wanted to see if my assistant read it out correctly, my AI assistant. So this is the first time hearing chapter 1, and the reason I included chapter 1 was because I was kind of unimpressed by the prologue on my first reading, and then I was like, well, that's a bit unfair because it's supposed to launch off into whatever you're doing to follow. And so I gave you the benefit of the doubt, or gave this writer the benefit of the doubt, and included the chapter 1, and honestly didn't actually get me much further there. I struggle to care. This is the dark thing here, and this is just might be me personally, but whatever. This is my damn channel. So the thing here is that Ada is the only time I started caring with the whole first chapter, because essentially you're watching a girl being dragged down the street to whatever, out of the town or whatever, and it's only at the end where her pain was as her hidden and sharp was very interesting. That I like your turn of phrase there. In fact, a lot of your turns of phrase, like you use a lot of good in I don't know what period this is. It's obviously like some kind of sword and fantasy kind of thing. So looking for that Middle Ages kind of feel to it. But half chip horror is fantastic. Of suture busting, his more civilized form of suture busting, that's great. I really like that. But there's bits and pieces here that your turns of phrase are quite good, like her pain, like her hidden sharp. But fuck man, I don't care. Like I just don't. And I don't know what it is. I think it's along the lines of we get a lot of. I know what it is. Okay. So, for both scenes, for the prologue, this is my hypothesis as to why I'm not really feeling this piece. Is that the prologue? I'm sorry to be scrolling up all around the place. She doesn't necessarily have a scene goal. This character is starting off in a passive sense. She's being dragged down the street and she's not really doing anything. She's struggling, sure, but I guess you could say her scene goal is to survive or to not be dragged down the street. But that's not intrinsic. It's from the external. So she's not active. She's a passive protagonist in this first section here. That's probably why I don't find it very engaging. Sure, I'm seeing it happening, and I was actually half expecting this. Like, if the piece wasn't called, or the book wasn't called Ada of Tumber, I was kind of expecting this prologue character to die. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised because it's fantasy if the prologue character died, and then you pick up chapter 1 with her waking up in the afterlife. Like, it could be one of those openings. Because I wasn't expecting her to stay passive into chapter 1. In chapter 1, you could argue that she's being active because she's going to the town of Tumber and she's watching it for some reason, which you don't really get an idea of. But because you have so little idea for what her motivation is, you don't really have there's nothing to grab hold of. There's no ticking clocks here. There's no nothing at stake. That's a big one. So initially you could say there was something at stake. You felt like there was something at stake, but nothing actually happened to her aside from being hit across the head or whatever. That's what those are her last memories of Tumber. So she's essentially thrown out of the town or something. I don't think it's really that clear what happens, or if it was, I kind of missed it. So she's thrown out of Tumber, so nothing really happens to her. Like you don't really get a sense of, yes, it was like a break from home or whatever, but no real sense of like, oh, she didn't leave children behind or anything. Like, or she wasn't like, being sent to an internment camp or anything. She was just thrown out of town. And the second one, she's just coming back to town. Also, there's obviously a large time skip here. Because she goes from this wilting violet to this supposedly, well, I'm guessing she's some kind of warrior because she has a bow. I don't know why her scabbard is swordless. I assume there's some fantasy shit happening there where that will make sense later. But at the moment it doesn't really make sense. No reason for it to be swordless, but I guess that's like a lamppost you're leaving for someone else to pick up later. But still, yeah, so that happens. Okay, that happens. Then she just sits there and waits. That's chapter 1. I don't get it, man. I don't get it. I don't know what you're trying to do here. You're setting up a tone with the prologue, and you're setting up some kind of situation with chapter 1. But this is not close enough to things actually happening for me to care. Aside from that, your writing is actually quite good. You have a couple good turns of phrase, but yeah, it's overall without some like a real hook here. The terms I frequently use is when the engine turns on, and I did not feel the engine turn on in this whole first bit here with the prologue and the chapter 1. I felt it ended, chapter 1 ended, and I was like, shrug. So sorry for that. My main thing would be bring it closer to the first event, whatever the first event is. I know the prologue is a setup for obviously her past and possibly something that will be reflected again in the future, but bring this whole thing closer to when she has a proper scene goal where she's being active in the scene. And if you start off there where she has a proper scene goal as being active in the scene, or if you're being passive, at least give her a way to succeed in the scene, or demonstrate something about her character. Because she doesn't even do that either. In the first chapter, you just demonstrate that she's able to be thrown out of town, which is not the greatest hint for a main character. I know you're setting up a growth there that happened while she was away from town, but you're skipping over that, so it's not really adding that much to it. Unless you want to paint in that growth over time over the rest of the piece. But even then, it's a gutsy move that I'm not sure is paying off. So I'd bring this closer to whatever her first real goal is, and make it articulate to the reader, or at least drop breadcrumbs to the reader to make us curious what that is. So it could be that your book finally turns on at chapter 2. I'm not sure. But it does not turn on here. Not for me. Maybe the audience will disagree though. So if you disagree, feel free to leave comments down below in this video. Again, the original post, as usual, is in the description down below. So you can click that, go to the original post, and message the actual writer there. So again, that is Reddit user asdJesus, and this piece was Ada Tumblr. Thank you for listening. See you guys next time.